So today I'm going to talk about the geopolitics of critical minerals in the energy transition. Like my grandfather said, this is really becoming a hot topic. So it's kind of nascent, but it's going to be one of the most important fields, I think, going forward. So just to give my lecture a brief outline, I'll start by defining critical minerals, and then I'll move to talking about the energy transition and the role of China and how that relates to critical minerals. And then I'll focus on a little case study with lithium and cobalt being the main minerals. And I'll talk a little bit about human rights issues and how China affects those. And then I'll move on to some closing thoughts. So to start off, what is a critical mineral? The general definition people agree on is critical minerals are mineral resources that are essential or critical to the economy and whose supply may be disrupted. So when we think about what is a critical mineral today, this definition changes with, supply changes and changes in society's needs. And today we're so dependent on technology that many critical minerals are mostly metals that are central to high-tech sectors. So that includes rare earth elements and some other metals. And now that global economies are so interconnected and many of us are using the same products, some minerals are widely called critical, but at the same time, certain countries may consider a mineral critical while others do not, just based on factors like supply, demand, access, etc. And then also they're called different things depending on where you are in the world. So in the EU, they're called critical and raw minerals. And then in Japan, they're called rare minerals. And the US's official definition for critical minerals was created just 2 years ago in the Energy Act of 2020. So under this bill, the government now has to create a yearly list of which minerals are critical to the United States. So to do this, the bill defined critical minerals. And there are 3 parts that are important for defining, what's a critical mineral for us. So first, they're essential to economic or national security for the US. Second, the supply chain has to be vulnerable to disruption, and that could involve foreign political risk, abrupt demand growth, protectionist behaviors, etc. And then lastly, critical minerals must serve an essential function in manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for the economic or national security of the United States. So that's what they are in short. Basically, without them, we would just be in a lot of trouble. So every year now, the US Geological Survey determines which minerals are critical for us. And here's what they posted for 2021. In this image, you'll see I bolded all of the minerals that are essential to the energy transition. And mostly these are used in batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. And you can see they make up a pretty substantial part of this list. So when thinking about critical minerals, like I said, different economies are motivated by different concerns depending on what minerals they already have and their industrial structures. So for example, in the US, we're most concerned about import dependence and how that could be exploited by foreign powers like China or, Russia, for example. But in contrast, in the European Union and Japan, they're more concerned with the effects of supply disruptions on their industrial competitiveness. And then one other point I'd like to make is other countries have actually been making critical mineral lists for a lot longer than the US. In many ways, the US is behind on studying this issue. So for example, the EU published its first list of critical minerals in 2011. And again, we just started doing this 2 years ago. Oh my gosh, sorry, my lights go off sometimes because our building is energy efficient. I'm just gonna leave them off because they will probably go off again. Okay, so why did the US just start prioritizing critical minerals now? I would argue that this is because the energy transition and China. And these are 2 separate things, but they're very interrelated, and their relations to critical minerals has serious national security implications. So let's start with the energy transition. So the International Energy Agency in 2021 forecasted that by 2026, the planet's renewable electricity capacity will rise more than 60% compared to 2020 levels. And that's equivalent to the entire current total capacity of fossil fuels and nuclear power combined. Solar is expected to make up more than half of that. Additionally, global electricity storage is expected to expand by 56% in the next 5 years. Lithium-ion batteries will make up a smaller portion of this, but still a significant amount. And EV growth, EV is electric vehicles, I'll just call them EVs for short. EVs are expected to skyrocket. They should make up half of all light duty vehicle sales by 2026 and possibly 100% by 2040. The energy transition will require a lot of minerals. In this graph, you can see which power sources in the energy transition are going to require the most mineral demand and how this is forecasted to change over time. So the y-axis is mineral demand and the x-axis is increasing policy ambitions for climate change. So in the future, the share of total mineral demand rises significantly and storage and transmission makes up the biggest portions of demand for minerals by far. And then I wanted to mention this is a term that comes up a lot when we're talking about mineral demand. So you can see right here, bar 3 says sustainable development scenario. This refers to the Paris Agreement's goal to keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So this is kind of the main climate goal the world has agreed to. So when I say sustainable development scenario, just think ideal climate policies that we should see pretty soon. And then this graph does a great job of breaking down the types of minerals that are used in different energy sources. So right now, clean energy technologies are quickly becoming the fastest growing segment of mineral demand. And you can see that for traditional technologies like coal and natural gas, they didn't really need that many minerals, but compared to clean energy technologies, they have a much higher demand for minerals in both the quantity, but also the variety. So I'm going to make this graph a little bit more digestible and break this down by sources. Okay. So for wind turbines, rare earth elements like neodymium and dysprosium are key ingredients of permanent magnets. And those are just really powerful magnets that don't lose their magnetic fields, and they're heavily used within turbines. And then for solar panels, borates, gallium, germanium, and indium are very important ingredients and also critical minerals. Cobalt and lithium are required for the lithium-ion batteries used in electric vehicles. You might know some about that because of my grandfather's presentation. And then nickel and manganese and graphite are also often used in electric vehicles. And then also, if you think about it, a lot of the best renewable energy sources are located really far from human settlements. So for example, places that are great for solar tend to be deserts, or places that are great for wind tend to be the plains, not close to cities. And wind turbines and solar panels also take up a decent amount of space. So that's another reason they're not in cities. So electrifying everything is going to require a huge increase in electric transmission networks, which are primarily made of copper. So copper demand is also predicted to soar. Electric cars are a big part of the energy transition and its effect on critical minerals. A typical electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car. And under the sustainable development scenario, mineral demand use for EVs and battery storage is a major force, growing at least 30 times to 2040. Although copper isn't a critical mineral, because the supply is pretty steady, you'll notice here that copper demand should also spike, and it's pretty significant. According to a World Bank study, the demand for component minerals for electric storage batteries, such as aluminum, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and nickel, could rise by more than 450% by 2050 if clean energy technology is deployed under the sustainable development scenario. And here, just to emphasize again the demand aspect, you can see expected growth in demand for minerals for all clean energy technologies from 2020 to 2040 under the sustainable development scenario. So lithium sees a major spike in demand, over 40-fold, but then cobalt and graphite and nickel also see substantial increases as well. And, you know, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but I want to just emphasize that. I mean, a 40 times increase in demand is remarkable. And you might also be wondering what this little dot is, sustainable policy, stated policy scenario. That's just the policies that we have in place right now at the time that this was made in 2020, which is not enough to really make a difference for climate change. And we can expect that there will be more policies put in place, so it's not really relevant. So although an electrified world promises more stable, diversified energy sources, limited critical mineral supplies could create price swings and introduce new vulnerabilities. So I think a really important part of this is thinking about the supply side, because if we're trying to think about how to make critical minerals secure, there are a lot of factors that complicate supply. So first, the critical minerals are really geographically concentrated. So production of many critical minerals needed for the energy transition, it's more concentrated than even oil or natural gas. And that's even higher for processing operations, where China has a really strong presence across the board. I'm going to spend more time talking about that in the rest of my presentation, so I'll leave that there. Another factor that complicates supply is there are long project development lead times. So it takes around 16 and a half years on average to move mining projects from discovery to production. So if demand spikes in the future, which it probably will, it could be really hard for supply to ramp up quickly because of these long project lead times. Another issue is declining resource quality. So the quality of different metals can decline with more extraction. The average copper ore grade in Chile has declined by 30% over the last 15 years. And extracting metal content from low-grade ores requires a lot more energy, higher production costs, and more greenhouse gas emissions and waste volumes. And then lastly, consumers and investors are increasingly calling for companies to source minerals that are sustainably and responsibly produced. But most high-performing metals do involve some environmental, social, and governance concerns, as I will talk on later. So when we think about the supply outlook for the future, it's kind of a mixed bag. In the near term, some minerals are expected to be in surplus, some are in tight supply, but looking ahead with all the climate policies that we should be putting in place, supply from existing mines and projects under construction is expected to only meet half of projected lithium and cobalt requirements by 2030. So what we do know is that these minerals will be expensive. And that means that even as technology gets more efficient and, you know, electric vehicles are using fewer minerals, if mineral prices skyrocket, it doesn't matter how efficient or cheap these clean energy technologies get. They will be expensive, and that can impact how well we carry out the energy transition in terms of, you know, expensive things like grid investment, energy security, energy access, etc. So now I like to say that it's kind of this big board game where all of these countries are scrambling to gain control of different minerals. And one country really has others beat, and that's China. Chinese companies account for more than half of the world's cobalt and lithium production. Global value chains for EV batteries are dominated from top to bottom by Chinese suppliers. They account for more than 80% of the raw materials for advanced battery materials. China's development of midstream and downstream capacities has turned it from a supplier of raw minerals and materials to a key consumer of them. Their control of supply chains is a key factor that shapes other economies' strategic responses. China has come to particularly dominate parts of the electric vehicle supply chain. In this graph, you can see that they're a major player in every step, but especially dominant in midstream or refining. In lithium-ion battery manufacturing, China has a majority of processing capacity for key components like cathodes, anodes, separators, and electrolytes, as well as almost 80% of global battery cell manufacturing capacity. This holds true for other industries too, though. The building blocks of solar panels are called wafers, and China has 90% of the world's wafer manufacturing capacity. So, I mean, we're pretty dependent on them. And then China also has, or Chinese companies at least, own 72% of global solar panel module manufacturing capacity. And then the same is true for the wind turbine value chain. It's home to about half of total manufacturing plants for many different parts that are necessary for wind turbines. In this chart, you can see that extraction of energy-related minerals compared to fossil fuels. So at the top, you'll see oil and natural gas extraction. And you can see that the US in light blue plays a huge role, giving us an advantage for so many years. But if you look at critical minerals extraction, you can see that China in the medium lavender color plays a larger role. And this becomes even more shocking when you look at processing of minerals and fossil fuels. So again, the US had some control in oil refining and also LNG exports. But if we look at the processing of critical minerals, now China vastly dominates all of them, and the US has no power in these areas. And then I have one more graph to illustrate this because it's just a point I really want to hit home. This shows the refining capacity, this shows basically the supply chains for batteries, wind power, and solar power. And it really illustrates how China dominates the entire supply chain. So you can see China's in red, and in literally every step, they are dominant except for wind turbine assembly, which is just one part. So it's pretty remarkable. And we have to remember that these are the resources of the future for energy. And that has pretty big national security implications. We all have to make the energy transition, and it's become far more cost effective at this point than oil and gas. And we've even seen that renewables offer more energy security because once you have them, you aren't dependent on other nations for energy, like Russia and the crisis we're in now. But what happens if our relationships with China go south? We don't really have the capacity to compete with them in manufacturing and having control of all these different parts of the supply chain. So we could be stuck in yet another energy crisis. So why is China so dominant? China is mainly dominant in critical minerals and the clean energy supply chains because they planned for it and they invested in the resources that they needed that they didn't have. Additionally, since they came to the big economy game kind of late, they don't have robust regulations developed yet, which is really a polite way of saying that they can produce without worrying about environmental or social issues. And I'll talk about all of these in this presentation. So production of critical minerals in China and prioritization of this dates back to 1986, when the government put plans in place to develop its rare earth industry and prohibit foreign investment in the mining sector. Up until 2014, China also had export and production quotas for rare earth metals. And in recent years, China's regulation on this topic has only more aggressively worked on the security of their supply chains, and they're digging in even more to these policies now that other countries are starting to pay attention to this issue. But out of all of these plans that have contributed to China's success and dominance, none is more important than their Made in China plan, which is also called MIC-25. So this plan was created in 2015 as a new national strategic plan and industrial policy that aimed to secure their position as a global powerhouse in high-tech industries. And China sees MIC-25 as a chance to fully integrate into the global manufacturing chain, but also to become a direct competitor with other value-added economies like the EU and the US. They wanted to move from being the factory of the world with low-skilled jobs into an economy that produces the technology that everyone needs. That way, they wouldn't be dependent on foreign nations for technology. Foreign nations would be dependent on them. New energies and electric vehicles were listed as a target industry within this plan, and that's what they've done. And they've done this through increasing control in the supply chains by basically what happens is just state banks give loans to Chinese companies and then they just take control and eat up the supply chain. So now I'm going to talk about lithium and cobalt as case studies, and I'll analyze the role of China in these industries as well as ESG factors, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. So since I work in Latin America, lithium is mainly what I study. This graph shows the main producers of lithium from 1995 to 2020. And you can see that Chile, Australia, China, and Argentina appear to be the main players. And that's mainly because of their lithium mining capacities rather than the proven reserves that they have. I'd also like to point out as a side note that the spike in this graph around the late 2010s is just because electric vehicles and energy storage technologies are taking off. So again, Argentina, China, Australia, and Chile are the biggest producers. But you can see in this graph that while Australia by far produces the most, it doesn't actually have the biggest capacity, or sorry, the biggest reserves. Chile does, but it produces far less. And even more interestingly, the country that actually has the most lithium reserves is Bolivia, which isn't even on this list because their industry is so underdeveloped. So over 60% of the world's proven lithium reserves are found in what's called the Lithium Triangle, which is in South America. On this map, you can see, and it includes Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And Argentina and Bolivia have the most, but Bolivia by far takes the cake. But again, you won't see Bolivia on any lists because they don't have the human capital to extract it or to chart it across the mountains to get it to export because they would have to go through Chile. And then this dynamic is also true for cobalt, where the vast majority of the world's cobalt lies in Democratic Republic of the Congo, but most of it is mined by Chinese companies due to, lack of human capital. So this map, it looks a little complicated, but I think it shows, the human rights aspect of this. So the darker a country is on this map, the more fragile and corrupt it is. And then the circles are different types of critical minerals. So you can see that a lot of the critical minerals that we need lie in more corrupt areas of the world, except for Australia. And this data was taken from 2018. So of course, a lot has changed since then. Chile, Russia, and Ukraine are a lot more fragile, but you get the picture. Much of the minerals we need are found in states that have problems with good governments. And here's a map for cobalt, just so you can see in closer detail. It's really concentrated in Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is a very fragile and corrupt state. And when you're mining in a very fragile and corrupt state, it's pretty easy for things to turn violent. And then here's another map for lithium. You can see, again, it's heavily concentrated in South America. And I would argue, again, that since 2018, these countries have become a lot more fragile and corrupt. So it would be darker in today's data. So now I'm going to move on to just talking about cobalt for a little bit. Cobalt is used in batteries of many modern electronics like smartphones and laptops, but also in EVs and energy storage. In particular for EVs, it's found in three of the four major lithium-ion batteries on the market. And in other words, cobalt is just an integral part of a low carbon economy. 60% of the world's cobalt comes from Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, and it's the largest source of export income in the DRC. This country also mines many other metals besides cobalt, but despite their rich mineral wealth, their history of war, weak governance, and corruption poses a risk to responsible mining. On top of this, nearly 3/4 of citizens live in extreme poverty. It's ranked as the 10th poorest country in the entire world in 2020. Under half of households have access to drinking water. 43% of children are malnourished, and just half of children complete primary education. So in such an extreme situation, it's really easy for desperate people to fall in situations that might abuse their human rights. So 20% of DRC's cobalt exports come from artisan small mining operations, which is featured in this image. They're called artisan small mining operations, which is the shorter way to say that is ASM. So ASM sites aren't inherently dangerous, but they are prone to a lot of risks due to minimal oversight, regulations, or safety measures. So they can be associated with high rates of death and injuries. Several reports have found that ASM mines employ children working for less than $2 a day, and that workers did not have access to protective equipment, were exposed to harmful chemicals, And on top of that, state officials extorted illegal payments from artisan small miners. And then here's another picture so you can see just from a different angle. And if you think about it, it's likely that much of the world's minerals come at the cost of environmental and human rights, but it's just now that people have started realizing how important they are that they're paying attention to them. So for example, in 2019, Apple, Google, Dell, and Microsoft and Tesla were the subject of a lawsuit alleging that they aided and abetted in the death and injury of children working in cobalt mines that ended up in their products. A lot of this cobalt will go into EVs made by Ford, GM, and Tesla, which buy Chinese mined Congo cobalt. A Tesla EV requires about 10 pounds of cobalt, more than 400 times the amount found in a cell phone. So really, again, EVs will cause this commodity to skyrocket in demand. And with all of these social and environmental costs, you might think, well, what about just doing away with cobalt altogether and finding a different resource? Tesla actually announced it was planning to do that soon. But industry experts say that no transition mineral is perfect. Lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc are all associated with human rights violations. And then on top of that, artisan small mining is also a lifeline for millions of the world's poorest people. So you don't want to see it outlawed, but we do need more regulations. And DRC is working on regulations, new pilot mines, but overall companies need to take responsibility and try to find a way to clean up this industry. So now just a quick overview of China's role in DRC and how this has caused security crises for the US. So compare the images you just saw to this one, which is a massive Chinese cobalt mine. This is a quote from a resident after a US cobalt mine was bought by a Chinese company. Once the blasting starts, the walls of mud brick homes will crack. Chemicals will seep into the river where women do laundry and dishes while worrying about hippo attacks. Soon, a manager from the mine will announce that everyone needs to be relocated. The US has not been keeping up with China in the Congo. In 2016, 2 major cobalt reserves in Congo, owned by American mining giants, were sold to a Chinese conglomerate, marking the end of any major US mining presence of cobalt in the country. The Obama administration and the Trump administration didn't prioritize this issue enough. And then on top of that, when Trump rolled back requirements on American automakers that were intended to accelerate transition to electric vehicles, China got an even wider lane to step into this industry. Additionally, at the same time, we were in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so that locked up our resources, but also Congo's poor record on human rights and grafts scared away many Western investors. Regardless, now that we realize how important this mineral is, competition is really heating up. In the past few years, China has been on a buying spree of cobalt mines in Congo. And as of last year, 15 of the 19 cobalt mines in Congo were owned or financed by Chinese companies. Those companies have received at least 12 billion in loans from Chinese state-backed institutions, and they're likely to have drawn billions more since. The Biden administration warned that China might use its growing dominance to squeeze out Americans' manufacturers in terms of electric vehicles. And so to work around this quagmire we're in, the US is pressing for access to cobalt supplies from allies like Australia and Canada. But again, most of the cobalt is found here, so that can't really solve the issue in the long run. And on top of that, now the Congolese government has qualms with China. They have accused Chinese mining companies of cheating the country of promised revenues and improvements. And the Congolese are reviewing past mining contracts with financial help from the US government as part of a broader anti-corruption effort. They're also examining whether Chinese promises to build roads, schools, hospitals, other infrastructure projects were actually kept. Similarly and separately, some miners say that safety hazards increased after Chinese ownership. A lot of the same stuff I mentioned earlier, like just doing things without any training or oversight. And this is dangerous work, so it's pretty serious. Safety inspectors also said that they were forced to accept bribes to overlook these issues, and one officer reported being assaulted when he rejected to take the bribe. And to be fair, overall, increased mining and refining of cobalt by Chinese companies has helped meet growing demand worldwide, but that doesn't take away from these safety concerns. They're definitely real. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about lithium because this is my specialty in comparison. So here's some of the main technologies that have lithium. They're heavily used in lithium-ion batteries. Again, you might know about that from my grandfather's lecture. This year alone, prices for lithium compounds are up over 200% on several global markets. And much of that is just owed to increases in EVs. Lithium can only be accessed through large-scale mining, either by mining hard rock or extracting metal from brines, which is what you see here. Most of the lithium comes from brines from the lithium triangle, which again is Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. The process works by extracting lithium brine from underground by drilling hundreds of feet, and then that's emptied into a series of rectangular evaporation ponds that surround the plant, and that's what you see here. And then these are just mounds of lithium after extraction. Extracting from lithium brines is extremely water intensive and prone to really high pollution rates. A ton of lithium usually requires as much as 500,000 gallons of water. On top of this, there are worries that extracting from lithium brines could result in aquifer contamination, which again would reduce the amount of water that is available to communities that live here. And then this is an image of hard rock mining for lithium, just so you know what it looks like. It's a lot easier to do it this way. It's found in Zimbabwe and Australia in that form. Again, in this area, China has advantages. It already controls substantial lithium assets in South America. And over the last 3 years, it invested 4.5 billion in lithium reserves in the region. And just like other cases in this, the way they do it is Chinese banks give low interest loans to Chinese mining companies to make the constructions. And we can only expect this to increase in the future. China's been heavily investing in Argentina to the point where people are calling it a white gold in reference to the gold rush. And a lot of the extraction still has yet to take off. So there's less documentation about what they're actually doing, but Argentina just signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's main way to increase economic connectivity, free trade, and also grow their power in the region. So we can expect lithium investments to just continue to skyrocket. The Lithium Triangle area is in the San Atacama Desert and other major wilderness desert areas. And it also happens to be the home of indigenous people who rely on grazing lands for subsistence farming. So again, this is in some of the world's driest regions. People have found a way to make a living and live off the land for hundreds of years, but now intensive mining threatens their access to water. At least one community already has to have potable water trucked in. And this sign is just from one of the many protests. It says, "Water is worth more than lithium." When the Washington Post visited 6 communities on lithium extraction sites in Argentina, they found that these communities are very impoverished and lithium mining is not really bringing green jobs or development to be worth it. Several community leaders actually said they regretted signing deals with the lithium companies because there was a big lack of transparency in contracts that resulted in them getting very, very little while these companies make unimaginable profits. I thought this was a really good example. One lithium plant was surveyed to be making around 250 million in revenue per year, and they paid 6 local indigenous groups it was extracting from a grand total of 178,000 per year. That is 0.07% of the revenue they're making. Some indigenous communities reported they weren't even aware that they should be getting paid, and others felt like they just had to sign the contracts and maybe they would create jobs, so they did it, but now they're running out of water. There's also a spiritual dimension to it. So their specific spiritual traditions are tied to the land, and they call the brines their mothers. So this is basically equivalent to us drilling into their holy land and making it hard for them to live there anymore. And of course, lithium mining doesn't only bring drawbacks to communities. It's not all bad. Some give medical insurance and dental insurance to employees or employ indigenous people, but even when they are employing indigenous people, they don't employ that many, and it causes a lot of conflicts in communities. One resident said this created division, doubts, distrust, and loss of respect within residents. So now they're basically just having to balance economic benefit versus pollution and water shortages. And even beyond that, they worry what will be accomplished in 20 or 40 years when the lithium companies exhaust their reserves. So a lot of companies are refusing to admit where they get their lithium from, and now you know why. But in reality, these companies have a bottom line and shareholders to be reckoned with, and we don't really have a choice with surging demand. And so the best we can do is draw attention to this issue and come up with a compromise. So I just have a few more graphs to show you that the human rights issue is not restricted to cobalt and lithium. In this graph, you can see where the most human rights allegations are per area for the minerals cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. And all of those are used in the energy transition. Between 2010 and 2020, 276 allegations of human rights were identified in 103 clean energy mineral mining companies. So you can see here that most of the allegations are in South America for lithium, copper, and cobalt, followed by Africa and cobalt and zinc. And then they also break it down by category, and most abuses fall into community impacts and environmental impacts, which I've described. And this graph's kind of hard to see, but just to break it down even further, most community impacts are health impacts, rights to peaceful protests, and indigenous rights. And the most environmental impacts have to do with water supply and water pollution. So overall, the story of the energy transition has two grim ironies. One is that metals mining is one of the world's dirtiest industries, responsible for at least 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Mining is also leaked to environmental destruction, freshwater contamination, and depletion, as well as mine waste dumping. But we have to mine these minerals in order to save the planet. The second grim irony is that the abuses of mining are being perpetrated against the people that are least responsible for the climate catastrophe. Indigenous people aren't the ones that have dumped CO2 into the atmosphere for the last 100 years. And yet it's their water that's being sucked up or poisoned so that people in developed countries can drive electric cars. And yet this is all saving the world, and we have to make the energy transition. And as these technologies currently stand, we have to invest in critical minerals, even with these grim ironies. So in conclusion, tackling environmental and social impacts of this industry will be essential because whether we like it or not, we don't have any other choice but to mine more. We need more transparency in supply chains, but also more benefits to local communities. And then bringing us back to where we started, we've seen that there are myriad factors that complicate the supply of critical minerals, but there's also some uncertainty in demand, which could heavily affect prices and thus the mineral security in the future. The largest source of demand variance comes from uncertainty around the stringency of climate policies. So that's to say that everything I've just outlined will matter by varying degrees depending on whether the world is actually heading towards a sustainable development scenario or not. Policymakers have a crucial role in narrowing this uncertainty by just making it clear their ambitions and turning targets into action. There are also other challenges to consider, like technological innovations. We're continually finding ways to use fewer critical minerals in our energy technology, but also innovation in extraction technologies is happening consistently. And recycling methods or enhanced metal recovery could help balance the markets. Thankfully, the Biden administration has really started paying attention to this issue on multiple fronts, and various agencies are working on increasing our supply access to critical minerals at home. But for the time being, China has the power over our clean energy future, and the disregard for human rights does not bode well for the communities living near extraction sites. But just to conclude this on a positive note, just last March 31st, a few weeks ago, the Biden administration invoked the Defense Production Act to give the government more avenues to provide support for mining, processing, and recycling of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel. He addressed his actions saying, we need to end our long-term reliance on China and other companies for inputs that will power the future. So basically, this action will increase funding to support our increasing investments in critical minerals. So hopefully the US is now working on it and things are going to change in the future and we'll have a more secure energy future. And that is my presentation. I took the entire time allotted. So if anyone has any questions, I can stay for a few more minutes, but I understand if you also want to get off of your screen immediately. I think you're muted, Pops.
I want to know if our best chance is to grapple with the current situation or to spend more time and effort on new technologies that don't require this. I know the automobile industry is hedging their bets. GM just signed 2 mammoth long-term contracts with a big mining company in Australia and another one in Canada, because all the car companies are trying to protect their supply chains for batteries.
Mm-hmm.
But simultaneously, everybody's trying to find a solid state battery that won't require as much of this stuff.
Right.
So you got any idea about who's going to win out on that?
I think time will tell. I think, demand is spiking right now as we speak. So we have to just do with what we've got in the meantime, but hopefully technology will progress. And, like I said, the administration right now is investing a lot in research and development and trying to have innovation. So I think we'll just have to see. But for now, we are dependent on these resources. And also now is a really critical time because it's when the industry is taking off. So it still matters.
What are they going to do with all those batteries?
That is another question. They're trying to figure out how to recycle them. But I think currently they don't really have a good solution. I haven't read up on that issue in a while, but last time I checked, there isn't really a solution. It's kind of like nuclear energy, you have these waste products and then you just have the waste product. You have to put it somewhere. And I mean, that's same with like solar panels and wind turbines too. The average lifespan of a solar panel is like, I think 15 to 25 years. So after that, where are all the solar panels going to go? Who knows? There are a lot of unresolved questions.
Well,
one of the questions that this all brings up is the extraction industries, and the rare earth metals are obviously very important in the burning electrical world that we're approaching. But my concern is that these all require huge quantities of water. And we have a lot of people in this world, and all people and all crops and all living things need water. And the competition, as you know, if you understand or have seen the water wars out west, the water wars between Florida, Georgia, and Alabama will get worse. Mm-hmm. And we're not solving problems we're creating. And these things have to be considered because, I mean, California's got a horrible drought, but they have big businesses in agriculture and mining, and it does not compute. And yeah. We're obviously not planning for future technologies the way China has.
Right.
And I think maybe we should start thinking ahead as to what might come along and how to approach it.
Yeah, I agree. I think we are vastly underprepared. I think the one good thing is, we do have a strong economic position. And so, like I said, the one thing we really know is that everything's going to be very expensive in the future, but the US does have an ability to pay for those things compared to other countries, which is, just one of the sad tragedies for other nations. But also the water thing is going to be huge. Actually, Chile just instated quotas for each household in terms of the amount of water that they're allowed to use every day, because they've been in a drought for the last 15 years. And that's where a lot of the lithium comes from, and where we need to use all that water for for mining. So I think that ultimately desalination will probably have to happen, which again will just make it more expensive. And that's how we're going to be getting water in the future. And hopefully technology innovations will help cut down that cost. But I think that the only real hope I have is that we'll keep innovating our way out of this, creating plants that are need less water to grow, or farm structures that, I don't know if you've seen vertical gardens. They have these plants now that grow on walls so that water just drips down and you don't use as much. So I think we're gonna have to make very rapid changes in society in the next 20 to 30 years. And it's going to be a mess, verifiably.
Did the US have no power over those two companies that sold their mines in the Congo to the Chinese?
That's a great question. Maybe they did. I don't really know how. Obviously the US can put in sanctions so it can affect what companies are doing based on political concerns, but I think it just wasn't a priority at the time when it happened, because again, we just weren't paying attention to this issue early enough. And so I think that's why they didn't do anything, but maybe they could have. I think they could have.
And the US companies just did it for a profit.
Yeah.
With
China's just
no
paying.
consideration for strategy.
Yeah.
But big business.
They could have also sold them because of the human rights aspect, or, corruption. Maybe they didn't want to deal with it, versus China doesn't really care if it's involved in that.
I think that's the reason why the U.S. got out of Congo, is there were too many U.S. regulations that were applicable, and we could not cope with the corruption in Congo on a legally viable basis, whereas the Chinese don't care. They just do what has to be done.
Right.
There was no.
Of course, we don't have any corruption in the United States, maybe not to the same degree, but I wouldn't say that these companies that have sold their mines for profit are necessarily sterling examples of honesty or transparency.
Yeah.
Well, on that depressing note,
I know.
China has, and Russia did for a long time, have 5-year plans in which they spent their energies in a particular area which was undeveloped. And I hate to say it, but we're a pretty developed country, and I know that the capitalist system that we have doesn't call for government intervention in business, although we do intervene in business all the time. The point being that maybe the government ought to set some goals. We would like to be, in 5 years' time, we would like to be have a major role in X or Y, and go for it, and ask the businesses that start new businesses, or ask current businesses to participate in the plan. Because we've developed communications to the point where we don't even know how to control it anymore. And we don't need, I don't think we need all the various communications things that we have. We could, go for something else. It's not as sexy, but may get us where we want to be.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that, and this just wasn't really discussed that much in the policy sphere until, I didn't start hearing about lithium until probably like 3 years ago. So I think that hopefully, we all know now how important they are and how important they will be to our economy, especially because the US, likes to have control over its energy. So I think that going forward, I would expect nothing less than increased investments, a lot of government support, and a lot of research.
Mary Kimball, your presentation was excellent.
Thank you.
And you actually opened an area that I was woefully ignorant about. And And I'm sure there are many more areas that I'm ignorant about, but you really brought things in focus, and I congratulate you on such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. That is very kind. I practiced it with my parents last night a little bit, and they were like, this is way too technical. Make it more interesting. So I tried to frame it in a way that was relevant.
It was very, very interesting, and a lot of food for thought. And it's just, I mean, great job.
Thank you.
I want to know if there are any mutual funds involved in critical minerals.
Yeah, my dad last night was like, make sure you focus on the minerals that are going to skyrocket. People might be thinking about investments. He's been investing in lithium, so you could talk to him about it.
I want molybdenum and yttrium.
Barely pronounce those. It's complicated.
Well, all right. We appreciate it. It's been good to see you. Hope things go well in Washington.
Thank
Get 'em
you.
straight up there.
Yeah, so nice to meet all of you. Thank you for letting me take up your time. And this was great practice for me as well. I have to give presentations to government officials in like a month. So this was a great first try.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good rest of your
Bye.
day.